Good morning, everybody. We're meeting you from Wollongong PACOP. PACOP is Palliative Aged Care Community. Oh, God. You can tell that I've come from a very vast and different world. It's a Palliative Aged Care Outcomes Program from Wollongong University. Today is our September morning tea talk, and what we will be talking about is aged care and overwhelm. I'm Bronwyn. My background is that confusing, overwhelming background of aged care, residential aged care, specialist palliative care, aged care in the emergency departments, aged care in the inpatient setting, and more recently working in a specialist dementia-specific residential aged care setting before coming through to PACOP. Laura?
Sorry, I'm just answering a thing in the chat saying that they're having problems saying the chat, so I'll just fix those settings up. So my name's Laura. I am registered nurse background and come from a similar background to be working more recently in clinical management in aged care and all kinds of community palliative care, GP land, hospitals, a very varied background as well. So it's good to be able to bring that varied experience into PACOP.
Thank you. So as we move into our morning tea break with you, we would like to thank you all for joining us. Laura and I greet you from the lands and waters of the Dharawal, Gundagara, and Yuin peoples of the Darug Nation. We pay respect to the traditional owners and custodians of the lands that we're meeting on, and we acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging, and are grateful for the continuing cultural, spiritual customs and practices that guide and unite us, that they support us with. So one of the things that I'd like to just talk about is how the ideal model of aged care looks, or how we'd love it to look. So, you know, at the bottom there, holding us all up together, there's the government with all its policies and litigation supporting aged care. Other stakeholders coming into play. This would include NDIS and people who have a huge investment in residential aged care and the aged care sector. Then we look at aged care organizations. So these are the people who have bought into aged care, built the facilities, and have their own governance over aged care facilities individually at an organizational level. Of course, no aged care facility would ever work without the aged care staff. So the aged care staff sit very snugly in there, supporting the aged care family and carers and the residents who are at the top and who are ultimately the focus of this whole model of care. That's the ideal. What we do know, though, is that in the past 25 years, there's been a number of changes in the aged care sector. One of the first and major ones was the reform of the Aged Care Act, or actually the introduction of the Aged Care Act in 1997, which introduced a new funding model, the residential classification scale. Building certification became part of that, aged care standards, accreditation, aging in place. So prior to that, it hadn't, aged care was primarily looked after by government facilities or institutions or mandates, and not-for-profit organizations. Once this occurred, the deregulation occurred, private enterprise became very involved in aged care. And the impact of that then meant that we were looking at nurses, registered nurses being laid off, and skill mix changing, even less enrolled nurses being involved in aged care, and it became a land of AINs, personal care workers, looking after residents. One of the things that occurred too was the introduction of the Webster packs. I can remember when they came in, and that then meant that we didn't need to have the DD cupboards, and medications were dispensed into Webster packs, which could be given to anyone. I mean, this is a resident's home. So, at home, it would be themselves or their family giving them the medications, and this was extended into residential aged care. What we then saw in 2008 was the review of this particular classification scale, the funding model, and ACFI was introduced. At that point, there was a conversation about palliative care. First time really acknowledging palliative care in residential aged care. 2013, NDIS became involved, and My Aged Care, the actual platform, was introduced. Then we saw in 2014 quality of care principles. So a lot of us have been in residential aged care for many years, will have worked under those 4 standards, which expanded out to actually 44 total standards, substandards. And in 2016 and 2017, and although this is a little thing down at the bottom there, it's probably the pivot point in residential aged care in Australia. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the Oakden event. Laura, are you familiar with what happened at Oakden?
Do you want to just briefly touch on it for them?
Yeah, sure. So, Oakden was a facility in South Australia, and it was an environment where people with very difficult at-risk behaviours were placed. And it was an area where both end-stage dementia, as well as older people living with advanced mental illness, were placed in the same facility. And the staffing levels did not match the acuity or the case mix of those particular residents. And what ended up happening was there was an escalation in aggression. As a response to that, there was an escalation in physical restraint, chemical restraint. And it was really, this particular facility was under the watchful eye of South Australian government, but there was no local governance for this organisation. And ultimately, there were deaths from resident to resident aggression, as well as from neglect, which brought into spotlight a whole lot of changes. So there was the Elder Abuse National Response. There was a review of the National Aged Care Quality Regulatory Processes. And I think this also ultimately led to the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety being triggered, if you like. The Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Act was changed in 2018, or actually introduced in 2018. And there was an Aged Care Strategy Task Force. So I think things then became really quite compacted after this period of time. We saw NDIS reviews, aged care quality standards changed to the 8 standards we're working with now. And we know that they are looking at introducing clinical standards next year, so they will be expanded. There were the first national aged care managed quality indicators introduced, 3 of them, the Charter of Rights. And then in the middle of all of this, COVID hit. So we're struggling with the changes, and then we see COVID on the horizon, and we're battling COVID and also still trying to keep the straight trajectory of moving through reforms and improvement in aged care. It all becomes really quite sticky, I think, and we see NDIS amendments, we see the SIRS policy processes introduced to monitor, and I think, again, this is in response to Oakden as well, and the recognition of the fact that there's a lot of aggression in residential aged care. Increased national aged care mandatory quality indicators increased to 5. And then in the industry itself, we look at what was happening pre and also post 2020, and we don't feel as though there's a lot of improvement happening. In fact, post 2020, which is when all the recommendations from the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety were starting to roll out, we didn't feel as though things were improving. In fact, we felt as though things were getting worse. The staff attrition leveled up because we had a lot of staff leave the industry because of vaccination mandates. We had a huge amount of turnover because of staff illness and overwhelm. People who had been working in 2 different organizations to make ends meet from a wages perspective weren't allowed to work in different industries, in different nursing homes, aged care facilities. The death rate was exponential for a lot of facilities who may only have had a few deaths a year. The death rate started to escalate, and then we had isolated residents and families not able to be involved with the end of life, last months of life of that particular person's life. So it was tragic. I don't know if anyone's seen Everybody's Omar. That's a fabulous documentary that's just been released, But you see this family talking to Omar through windows, and they can't visit her, and they're putting signs up on the window. And she died whilst not very long after she went into the aged care facility, not long after COVID hit, and the family were communicating through windows at such a distance, such a distance as someone who had dementia. For staff themselves, we see that they were experiencing a realization of the underestimation of the acuity of the residents, and that aged care was becoming much more of a subacute facility environment. There was lots of criticism around how aged care staff had been looking after residents. Huge focus and drill down on the use of medications, and again, a lot of shaming around all of that. And we saw a lot more, there's just a lot more conversation around how many younger people were in residential aged care and the risk that they posed for older adults. And then we also saw that with COVID happening, 20% of people were dying within the first 3 months of being admitted. And of the total number of deaths in Australia, over 35% of those deaths were happening in residential aged care. Yeah. And as an outcome of that, we start seeing a great resignation. So in a workforce that was already under-resourced, where pay equity was not in place, where career pathways were not present or not well mapped out, where education and training was really limited to short bursts of, we've got overlap time in shifts, which ultimately a lot of organizations removed that overlap time. So opportunities for education, socialization, and building teams began to diminish. We begin to see this great resignation happening in residential aged care. And, this is just another layer of overwhelm. And I've deliberately made this slide look like this because I feel as though this is how we all feel. I feel as though, when you look at all of this, why would you not feel overwhelmed?
I need a big sigh after seeing all this.
Take a breath.
Slow it down.
But it's the reality.
It is a lot.
It's such a huge amount. And I think, although we're looking at reform, and reform is fantastic, reform again is adding extra layers of things. And how do we manage the reform with a positive headspace? But, at the moment, this is probably where we're looking at residential aged care. This is where the triangle is still there. The shape is still there. We're still trying to make sure that the resident is in focus at the top, but the systems are not strong enough. The governance is being worked on, and which this is about all the reform that's coming through. Ultimately, we will hopefully have a well-stratified triangle, but right now it looks like a jigsaw puzzle, and there are still some missing pieces in it.
And a lot of it's had to be adaptive and reactive in the context of COVID. And a lot of these things that are happening in the space that aged care homes have had no external control of. So it has had to be reactive and adaptive like this to get through.
And kudos to residential aged care and the people working in it for their responsiveness and for the reactiveness and for managing every single thing that came through the door and was hurtled at them, because that was the only way that the residents have actually been kept safe, and families have been kept safe, and staff as well. Ultimately, when we look at where we are now, 2 years down the track, I think we really should be congratulating aged care for keeping everybody as well and as safe as they have. Particularly when you look overseas and you see what's been happening overseas, I think Australia's done very, very well. So, the outcome of all of this then is people in overwhelm. So when we're looking at what overwhelm might look like and how people may experience it, it has, research has shown us that there's 3 fairly distinct areas that can occur. And stress, burnout, and compassion fatigue are actually 3 different things, but they can overlap enormously. So one of the main features of stress is the overreactive emotions, urgency, hyperactivity. There can be a loss of energy due to overwhelm, anxiety disorders, and there can be a lot of physical reaction and response to stress, cortisol levels, all of those things that occur as a stress response. Burnout is where it's almost the stress has pushed the person to a point where there's this enormous emotional component, and we start to see self-preservation occurring, and there's blunted emotions, but also there's a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, loss of motivation, loss of ideals. This is where we can start to detach from people, and that includes the residents. And when we begin to detach from people is when we begin to lose our ability to connect emotionally and to provide the care that we would ideally like to give people. But now we're in self-preservation mode. So that's what happens. We end up having to choose self-care at this point. It can lead to depression and a real sense of not having met or achieved the goals that you would like to achieve. And if you think that care nursing and aged care nursing, many people come to this because of a love of the industry, a love of people, a love of looking after older people. But when you reach the point of burnout, that love becomes really damaged and blunted and cut down or flattened out, if you like. And then all those amazing ideals feel lost. And you feel as though you've let the side down, or you've let yourself down, and you've let your team down. So the compassion fatigue then is an even greater extension of the burnout, where you feel disconnected completely. You're angry, there's anxiety and sadness, irritability, but now concentration begins to change, and performance at work may change. And then in the addition to all of the other things, you might be being performance managed or scrutinized, or feel as though you can't work in the space. And ultimately you feel as though the only answer is to leave. So the person in the middle of this story ends up with a huge amount of overwhelm. So just taking a moment to breathe around all of that. I think COVID has probably made this a lot worse. But I also think that the industry was moving to a critical point before COVID. And COVID may have actually escalated this whole thing, which feels terrible at the moment. But when we have a few years down the track, look back, we may all be grateful for COVID at a level for what it did in actually fast tracking a lot of the things that are coming up. So for anyone who is interested in having a look at burnout and the impact it has on you, there is a website that has a free tool, interactive tool. And if you're interested in checking your own burnout levels, I'd encourage you to have a look at that. So this will be available. This presentation will be available, and that web link will be available for you if you're interested. So it's not only people who end up in overwhelm. It's also organizations. And I think all of us have worked in organizations that have ended up becoming incredibly overwhelmed by this repeated process. So it's not just at a personal level, it's also at a governance level. This is happening in hospitals, this is happening in residential aged care, it's happening in health broadly, it's happening in industry, it's happening in retail. So time demands exceed the capacity that people have. The executives start to burn out. So your leadership people who are involved in the leadership group begin to burn out. So the people who are guiding you through this can't help you anymore. So at a personal level, this becomes very much more terrifying potentially, because you were looking at that person to bring you out of all of this, but now they're also burnt out. People are finding work unfulfilling. Career opportunities are not there, or if they're there, that's the career, that's the step into position you're going to go to, that executive role, and you're going to end up being burnt out and having time demands and things exceeding your capacity. You're going to be the next person burnt out. So would you choose that? Education and professional growth, we've already said there's been cut downs on overlap time, the ability to do study in work time. And so that whole professional development is not really happening. Employees finding themselves underperforming. So as an organization, this is really problematic, because now you can't deliver your outcomes that you're expected to deliver. So you as an organization become scrutinized. And there's this potential for vertical anger displacement, or we can see people getting feedback that feels like bullying, all of this because of the pressure that's happening from up top as well. So timelines, deadlines not being met, and triaging work becomes really difficult because concentration's poor, but there's so many particular focuses to be focusing on. And we start to develop that really reactive versus proactive response. So how do we break this cycle? How do we stop this from happening? How do we stop feeling overwhelmed? And how can we start looking at positive ways of moving forward? So one of the options, Laura, if you want to have a chat.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're here to help with is giving aged care homes a framework and a go-to roadmap to help them, I guess, overcome some of those challenges that we just saw in what individual and organizational burnout looks like, and really help them by giving them the roadmap and the framework to just start taking steps to move out of that and to move into these cycles where we're refocusing on prioritizing care, we're identifying the needs, those priorities that we need to address now, and then giving them those responses and that framework, really the guide to help them move into this period and be more proactive and be efficient with their workforce as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's a big part of what our PACOP tools do, is streamline and help with efficiency with tasks when staff just don't know where to go, where to start and what to do. And so having this framework really helps point them in the right direction. So standardisation can really help direct staff. Where are we up to? What's the next step? And we see this a lot through health and through aged care, is that through standardisation, we really can improve clinical care. And so we have this little cycle here. So identifying which problem needs to be solved, asking people close to the problem. So that might be residents, family, staff, it might be allied health or your GPs, talking with the team, getting the team back together and increasing that support and on the same page. Then that will really help with the overwhelm and the isolation that we're seeing with clinicians as well. And so really identifying the cause and then moving forward. And it's this repeated process, one step at a time, and having that really clear guide. And so we see at the bottom there, PACOP, it fits in with the National Aged Care Agenda. So we are aware of what's coming up. Bea, do you want to flick to the next slide for me?
Sure.
So PACOP's made up of two halves, if you like, two components that makes the whole program. And the first half is really for everybody in aged care. And so that's the framework of assessment for all residents routinely. And then after direct feedback from the aged care homes, they wanted a tool for deterioration. So we've really been built for purpose for the aged care homes. And this helps them meet care needs routinely or where there's concern, to guide care planning, inform referrals. There's comprehensive guides with evidence-based practices. And it's a bit like having the cheat sheets. Really, you get the answers. And so that really helps guide staff. And then the outcomes collection is for those residents who have identified needs. And this has been so important through our trial period, through COVID, through bushfires, through floods. For those residents that have identified palliative and end-of-life care needs, the outcomes collection is really the doing, and it guides them through delivering high quality palliative care, which we know is core business now for aged care.
Yes. So talking about core business.
Yes, so talking about core business, the Royal Commission into Aged Care, they came out and they basically said palliative care is core business for aged care, and there will be expansion in the aged care quality and safety standards of care to include palliative care standards. We know that some of the homes, I think the last quarter I was looking at the report, and standard 2 and 3 were where the most homes were receiving non-compliance notices with, and that is clinical assessment and personal care. And so we know that homes are needing these practical programs to help get them back on track and give them these guides and give them the tools and the resources to help their staff. Yeah,
it can feel overwhelming with all of these things, but I think if you can, like you in that previous slide where you're looking at the cycle and pointing out, looking for your priorities, establishing your priorities, having that strategy. I think, if palliative care is such a huge focus in residential aged care, it definitely is a strategy that needs to be prioritized, and how to manage it needs to be prioritized.
Mm.
And so I think, one of the things we were talking about, Laura, was how PACOP focuses the core business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I really love this representation. This is a bit like the juggling of the balls. We're all doing SIRS updates. We're all looking at the national quality indicators. Your home might participate in needs round. There's ANAT coming. There's all of these things, all these competing priorities, and this information that's really important for resident care. But often there's not a formal process to look at it all together. And so PACOP really helps support that in relating that back to resident care, and making it clinically useful, and seeing, well, how does this impact on the resident, and how can we look at that at a resident point of view, but at an organisational and service point of view as well. And so the feedback from a lot of our homes who've participated through our development has been that it's been handy to have one tool that kind of has little bits of everything in it to really shine a light on where they need to address issues.
Yes, and how PACOP actually makes use of data that has already been collected, like the SIRS, and when we talk about SIRS in this context, it may seem, well, how does SIRS tie in with palliative care? So many of the behaviors that may escalate, and the aggression, the incidents that come up, the falls, significant falls and harm from falls, is, that's your IMSs, but these incidents are often tied into end stage of illness. Could be, not so terminal agitation. Terminal agitation is not necessarily a language that people like using, but that's unrelenting agitation before someone dies.
Yeah,
And
it's zooming out and looking at the bigger picture.
Zooming out, exactly.
Yeah.
And people's trauma histories, all of that information, and the quality indicators that are collected on a monthly basis and reported on every 3 months, they're actually quite prognostic as well. So when you're pulling in all of this information you've already got an idea of what's happening to the residents, but then when you use PACOP, it validates all of that. It actually makes you go, oh, wow, that's made sense of all of that data. I understand now where all of those things that we've been collecting randomly, apparently, actually all form a picture about this resident, about where they're staged at the moment in their illness, and what their palliative care needs are looking like. And you can start to have that anticipatory care, that planning, working with families, goals of care, advanced care planning, identifying where you think this person's needs will go to when they start to die, and terminal care pathways or end-of-life care pathways. PACOP really brings all of that into practice.
And I just want to point out too what you just said there, Bronwyn. It's really important to note that shift from reactive care and responsive care to anticipatory care will really help with that overwhelm as well.
Absolutely. Because if you're feeling like you're reacting all the time, then you definitely can and will feel overwhelmed. But when you've got that strategy and the planning in place, that feels very different. Feels like you're in control again. And I think that's what we need to feel in aged care. We need to feel a sense of being in control. And I guess when we look at the future of aged care, it does have a positive future, although it may feel quite a lot at the moment. The allotness of it is because of not having really good structures in place. But now we have a focus. Now we see that there's national aged care reforms occurring, and there's a whole bunch of them, and that may produce overwhelm again. But like we've said, choosing your particular focus and your strategies, and obviously having the resident as point of care focus, where PACOP can help from a palliative care perspective, is looking at the top 5 points here, which is how does PACOP help you with your documentation that will support your request for changes in the resident's classification, and how does PACOP help you again with this narrative in being able to document what you're doing, so that when you're looking at your clinical standards and new clinical standards, particularly palliative care in 2023, having PACOP in place, you will probably already be meeting most of the criteria for that particular standard. the new increased aged care mandatory quality indicators, that those particular indicators also are, like I've said to you before, very predictive of deterioration in residents and prognostic, and it can help you formulate a picture of the resident so that when you're doing the PACOP assessments using validated tools, you actually have language to say, with this validated information, I can tell you, GP, nurse practitioners, people coming in, management, I can tell you what's happening to this resident, and we can start to predict what's happening to them from an end of life perspective. So there will be such a huge focus on palliative care, particularly moving forward into 2023. And there is an acknowledgement of increased resources and training requirements in palliative care and dementia, and PACOP can assist with that. So it could be a little bit of a quiet celebration there. And what we have noticed and observed from feedback from people who are already using PACOP is that what it has done for them, it has streamlined their approach to palliative care. It's supporting them. There's that very clear framework. And then from a feedback perspective, these are some of the things that the aged care facilities are talking to us about. You know, we do, PACOP provides reports every 6 months on what is happening in residential aged care of the facilities that are participating, and being able to show the organisation and the facility what you're doing in palliative care, how well you're doing. It's meant that there's been a lot of celebration and feeling of achievement. So again, this is addressing that sense of overwhelm. How do we begin to find ways of achieving, celebrating our achievements, and how do we achieve? And this has definitely been identified by one of the facilities. This is, you know, free evidence-based tools, all the resources and support. What's the catch?
Yeah.
So
we do get that a lot, don't we? When we show them all the resources and tool. And I think that, you know, it's really key to, if you think in your mind back about the pitch, the person that was in overwhelm, they were stressed. What would the other ones be? Stress, burnout, compassion fatigue. Whereas now we're moving to this model of support, feedback, and having a framework. So you can really see how as a team that can help your team move through.
Yes. So, you know, one of and this in this particular comment here, it's exactly what we've been needing. We've all wanted a place to go to when we've been concerned about a resident. So it's giving people, and there was a really cool one about here, this one. The language and skills learned through PACOP helped our junior registered nurse confidently take action and speak with an after-hours service to advocate for the resident. So it's providing that standardized language, and, you know, people coming in who've never done palliative care before don't have to be experts or skilled in it initially. What all they need to do is to follow the processes that are in place with PACOP, and the learning becomes embedded around that. And if you're using other partnering, you know, palliative care organizations for aged care, like PEPA and LDAC, Palliaged, PCC for You, there's so much rich education that can come in and start to increase and enhance the skill set. But what PACOP does is it provides that framework where you can go pattern month after month, 3 months after 3 months, review, and there's this very clear process, action plans, and critical thinking that it promotes and guides you in around palliative care. And this one, finally, a set of national tools to go to in a time of need. And this is what I was saying before about, you know, even if you have a high turnover, if you've got this framework in place, people can come in and just pick it up. You know, the quality and the depth of the information will get better, obviously, over time and with experience, but the process is there to keep it sustainable. Once we understood how easy the process was, we were very keen to start using it. And this is something we've seen a lot, particularly in the middle of this year, homes back into outbreak. And the outbreaks were not just COVID, they were influenza and also gastro, rhinovirus. There's a whole lot of outbreaks that were occurring. So in this particular case, this facility continued to use PACOP through that process, and their comment was that the assessments are really helping us to know where to start when looking after the residents. And then this was something we've been working quite a lot on how our training program works, acknowledging that there isn't a lot of time for training in practice at the coalface. And so we've created what we call clinical bites. So the maximum one, I think, is about 8 minutes, but they are little narrated presentations about the different tools. And the comment here is that breaking down the training into small bite-sized education worked a lot better than the long training sessions. So we can already see that there is a sea of change occurring, tide change, if you like, occurring with the people that we're working with. And there's a sense of confidence, and they're feeling as though they can achieve some very good outcomes for residents who are dying in their care. And that constitutes a very large proportion of the residents they're caring for. Yeah, so we have got some references there. And if you're interested in having a look at more about PACOP itself, there is a address there for you to write to us, email us if you would like more information. And this presentation will be available. The link will be sent out to you for you to review, and then you can have a look at some of those other things at your leisure. Any other thoughts or comments, Laura?
Oh, I was just going to say, if there's anyone that has any pressing questions, we're happy to answer some in the chat here, or where you can answer them via email if you are pressed for time, because it is after 10:30.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I'd have a brief comment. Thank you so much, Laura and Bronwyn, for this comprehensive overview that really acknowledges, wow, what the aged care sector and the aged care staff and the homes have been through in the last, that 25-year slide was mind-blowing. And it, you know, as you said, kudos to the homes and the staff and the residents who all journeyed through that. But for me also, it's kudos to the 8 aged care homes that we trialed our program with, that were doing all those things and trialing our program, and helped us develop what the framework we have today, which is really, as you pointed out, user-friendly. And whilst all the start of the talk was like, wow, this is a lot, it finished off with a truly positive note. And I know we're biased because we're all PACOP people, but the reality is those comments, you know, hearing, and these are real staff telling us, oh, thank goodness, a go-to tool to use when I don't know what to do, or when I'm worried, or it's just been, it's finishing on a high note, a positive note. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
So congratulations, aged care. I think you're amazing.
Yeah.
And we will continue working with you and supporting you to meet and get through the overwhelm, and to move into a really positive place for aged care in the next few years. Looking forward to it. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.